In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about perfectly competitive labor markets. Before we talk about this market in more detail, we should note that the roles of buyers and sellers in resource markets in general are the opposite of what they are in output markets. Specifically, firms provide the source of demand for resources, while households provide the supply. Because the commodity that's being exchanged in resource markets are the actual resources themselves. So in the labor market, the demand for labor comes from firms, and the supply of labor comes from individual people. Since we're assuming that we're working with a perfectly competitive labor market, we're assuming that all buyers and sellers in labor markets are price takers. What this means in practice is that each individual firm and each individual worker is too small in the labor market to have a significant effect on the price of labor, and the price of labor is just the wage rate. The degree of competition in the labor market is not generally related to the degree of competition in the output market. Even if you have a firm that is a monopoly in its output market, it may very well be operating in relatively competitive labor markets. Many power generating plants, for example, are monopolies in the distribution of electricity in their region. However, they're still competing with many other firms when they hire electricians or when they hire carpenters or customer support technicians. So in general, labor markets are for specific categories of labor. And how competitive those markets are is not related to how competitive the output market for the product is. Just as we've done throughout this course, we're going to use some basic principles of marginal analysis to determine the quantity of labor that firms are going to hire. We can note that a firm will add an additional worker only if the additional benefit, the marginal benefit of doing so, exceeds the marginal cost of doing so. The marginal benefit of hiring an additional worker is the value of the output created by that worker in that time period. So if you add an additional unit of labor, the benefit the firm gets from that is the value of the output that worker would produce with an additional hour of labor. In a competitive market, we define that to be the value of the marginal product, which is just equal to the price of the output times the marginal product of labor. For example, if a worker produces 4 extra units of output in an hour, and that output sells for $5 each, then that worker would be producing a total of $20 worth of output in that additional hour. So that's the additional revenue the firm is getting from hiring that worker. Here we have a graph of the marginal product curve. It's downward sloping in the relevant range of production because of the law of diminishing returns. When we first discussed marginal product, we noted that it might initially be rising. However, firms would never operate in the region where the marginal product curve is upward sloping. The reason for that is if it's optimal to hire 2 workers and the third worker produces even more, it would never stop with just 2 workers. So firms are only going to be operating in the region of the marginal product curve where it's downward sloping. To compute the value of the marginal product, we just multiply the marginal product of labor by the price of the output that's being produced. Because the price is constant, the value of the marginal product curve will be downward sloping because it's just equal to price times marginal product, and we've already established that marginal product will be decreasing in the relevant range of labor use. With marginal analysis, the marginal benefits of using labor, which is, in the case of a competitive market, the value of the marginal product, has to be compared to the marginal cost of using an additional unit of labor. We define the marginal cost of labor as MC sub L, and that's just the cost of an additional unit of labor. In this case, it would be the additional cost of adding 1 more hour of labor. But if the labor market is perfectly competitive and the firm is a price taker, the marginal cost of an additional hour of labor is just the wage rate, which cannot be affected by either the firm or the workers in the firm. To find the optimal level of labor use, we're going to combine the value of the marginal product curve with the marginal cost of labor. And when we do that, we get a diagram that looks something like this. Suppose we start with an employment level of L prime units of labor. At that point, the value of the marginal product, as determined by the value of the marginal product curve, is greater than the wage rate, which means that worker is adding more to the firm's revenue than it costs to add that worker. In that case, you would definitely employ that worker, but that would be true whenever the value of the marginal product is above the wage rate. So employment would increase at L prime, and that would continue until we got to L star, at which you would not increase labor beyond that point. If somehow the firm ended up at L double prime, it would find that the value of the output generated by that last unit of labor is less than what it costs to pay that worker, and the firm would cut back on labor use until it gets to the point L star. So the optimal level of labor use occurs at the level of labor use where the marginal revenue product equals the marginal cost of labor, which in a competitive labor market is just the wage rate. This would be true for any particular wage rate. So for example, if the marginal cost of labor is W prime, the optimal quantity of labor would occur at L prime. If the wage rate in the market falls to W star, then the optimal quantity of labor would rise to L star. If the marginal cost of labor is W double prime, then the quantity of labor would increase to L double prime. And what we observe here is if we go over to the value of the marginal product curve at any given wage, the quantity of labor is just specified by the quantity associated with that wage rate on the value of the marginal product curve. And therefore, what we see is that the value of the marginal product curve is the firm's labor demand curve. And what that tells us basically is there are two major determinants of the value of the labor demand curve for a firm in a perfectly competitive market: the price of output and the marginal product of labor. We'll come back to that in a subsequent video. This is all assuming that the output market and the labor markets are both perfectly competitive. But we could have a competitive labor market when the output market is not perfectly competitive. If the output market is not perfectly competitive, for example, if it's a monopoly or monopolistically competitive firm, in the output market, we know that the marginal revenue for the firm is less than the price of output. Because of that, the marginal revenue product curve will lie below the value of the marginal product curve. Because you notice the value of the marginal product is price times marginal product, while the marginal revenue product curve is marginal revenue times marginal product. Since marginal revenue is less than the price, marginal revenue product has to be below the value of the marginal product at any given level of labor use. In this case, though, when we have a firm that's in an imperfectly competitive output market, the demand curve is its marginal revenue product curve. What we're observing is that a firm that is operating in an imperfectly competitive output market will end up hiring less labor than would a firm with equivalent costs and revenue curves if it's operating in a perfectly competitive market. And that makes some sense because remember, when we're talking about output markets, we observed that there's allocative inefficiency for firms that are not perfectly competitive, and those firms end up producing less output and charging a higher price. What this is telling us is that those firms will also end up hiring fewer resources, in particular, in this case, labor. And that's because if you're not going to produce as much output, you don't need as many resources to produce it. So that inefficiency in the output market also results in a lower level of employment in the resource market. In general, though, in a labor market, the demand curve for labor is nothing more than the sum of the marginal revenue product curves for all the firms in that resource market. And in some cases, if they happen to be operating in perfectly competitive markets, that would just be price times marginal product. But saying marginal revenue product works for all firms. So if you compute the marginal revenue product for all the firms hiring that type of labor and you add them up, that gives you the market demand curve for labor, which, since marginal revenue product curves will always be downward sloping, will be a downward sloping labor demand curve. We're also going to assume that the supply of labor is upward sloping. When the wage rate goes up in a particular labor market, some workers will choose to work more hours because work has become relatively more beneficial for them. Others will switch from other labor markets to this labor market because this labor market is now paying relatively more. And some individuals who are currently out of the labor market will choose to enter when the wage rate rises. So as a result, we have an upward sloping labor supply curve And the equilibrium occurs right at the point where the quantity of labor demanded equals the quantity of labor supplied. So the same basic principles that apply in the output market in terms of demand and supply analysis still apply in the case of resource markets such as the labor market.